Better? All right. My name is Tom Yablonsky. I'm one of the co-founders of Cleveland History Days, along with Tim Donovan, who didn't make it here today, but we tried to get to as many events as we could. This is the last day of Cleveland History Days. You might look on the schedule. We have some events coming up later at Lakeview Cemetery. And we do not have a closing ceremony per se this year, but we also have we have a last event that is at the former Jewish temple, which is now part of Case Western Reserve University. We have a concert there, but that's the only expensive event, so-called, we had in history. That one was $30, but probably there are tickets still available if you hope to attend that. So this is the second week we're doing this. We've done this every year in Cleveland History Days. We have visited some of Cleveland's most fabulous church architecture, including St. Stan's in Slavic Village, including last year St. Coleman's in this neighborhood. We've also been at Pilgrim Church. We've been at St. Michael's at Scranton. Any I'm missing, Tim? No, that's okay. We also had 2 years where we had COVID, so we did not have a church tour on that year. So five different years we've done this event. So I welcome you to this. We have a lot more to show. Cleveland just has an amazing architectural story because so many of the cultures that came here wanted to build a grand statement about their relationship with God, and they really built some fabulous churches. And this is, if not the most fabulous, certainly one of the most fabulous churches. My intention coming into this year was maybe to put St. Ignatius of Antioch on the list because they are trying to raise a lot of money right now to stabilize, not that it's in bad shape, but their architecture, they're going to go through a number of architectural repairs. So we also want to support the churches in question and maintain their viability. With that, I'm going to give you Cleveland's ultimate church historian who's been with us all along, Tim Barrett. And Tim's we had 38 partners this year on History Days events. Tim is one of the partners, very important partner to allow us to do this type of programming. And I would tell you, although I can't say it for sure, stay tuned. Next year will be the 8th year of History Days. The other thing I want to highlight is this program grew off our Take a Hike program. So starting tomorrow, we still have 3 more months of Take a Hike. There is a Take a Hike every day of the week, a different one. So if you're interested in that, the website's takeahikecle.com. This morning, for example, on Sundays, is our Playhouse Square Take a Hike. So those are our 2 main heritage tourism programs in Cleveland, funded partially through the Ohio and Erie Canalway National Heritage Area. The local group that is really the convener and the facilitator and the budget that gets this stuff done is Canalway Partners, now functioning as Canalway. The Canalway website has all these programs and activities. So please check into that if you want to make a donation of any kind or join Canalway. It's very much a citizens organization. I'm happy to report just during the past week, our major project of a physical nature is the Towpath Trail. Wouldn't have happened without Canalway. Our prior director, Tim Donovan, our current director, Mara Cardenas. Tim raised $54 million over what was called the impossible dream in many people's eyes. We thought we never could get it done. But that's what built the towpath from Harvard Avenue all the way into downtown. At the spot we're ending, it's called Canal Basin Park, and that's what I wanted to point out. We received $250,000 in the past week from the state's capital budget, and we're going to announce hopefully soon that we've matched that money with our own fundraising with an additional $250,000. The overall project could end up being as high as $15 to $25 million, but we have gotten about $3 million so far. It's going to be done in phases. So Citizen Action gets this stuff done, so please stay tuned, stay involved, and look up the Canalway website. And Cleveland History Days is also a website where you can locate us. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Barrett. We will have a time at the end for some questions and answers, but And by the way, if you can't hear or something changes, just raise your hand, please, because we want you very much to hear this presentation.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome to the Church of St. Stephen. I always start a Sacred Landmarks tour with the old folk tale. The first time you come into a mosque, temple, or church, you make a wish. And there's some power behind the wish, unless you've been here before. Better luck next time. This particular structure is so laid out deliberately by the Germans who built it, more than any other church that I know of. There are others that have the kind of connection, but this one, as you'll see, has many, many, many of them. I'm going to start with the context of how do we get here. It was very brief, but the idea of what brought the area into development. And so briefly, you have to realize that Cleveland at one point had over 64 different ethnic groups that settled in the area. There were two great waves, one before the Civil War, which brought these northwestern Europeans, the Germans and the Irish, and then after the Civil War, the Central and Southern Europeans all moved in until the restrictions of the Congress that happened in 1920-24 that restricted immigration at that point. But anyway, the reason we have 64 different ethnic groups, and each one had different religious denominations, so start multiplying. And that's why we end up with houses of worship everywhere. This is a wonderful poster that was done by a Dale Gallus, and it shows many of the sacred structures of Cleveland, and buried in amongst them is the Tower of St. Stephen. We'll talk about the tower a little later. Now, as to the context, how do we get here? It starts with this gentleman, King Charles II of England. In 1662, he gave the governor of Connecticut, it was a colony at the time, a land grant. He did that quite frequently with the colonies. And so the land grant was given to Winthrop of Connecticut, and on a map, they used the northern and southern boundary of Connecticut, and then they stretched it from sea to shining sea. And that was Connecticut's claim. And by the way, it went over claims that New York already had, Pennsylvania's in the midst of it, and I think the king that did that deliberately, if they fight amongst themselves, I'll leave him alone. Whatever the reason, there was a lot of conflict during the time, and eventually we fall out with England. We have a Revolutionary War, which concludes in 1783. In 1785, Connecticut gives up most of its claim to the new government. Now it's a state. And they said, we can't give it all up. We have to reserve part of our western claim. Hence, we are the western reserve of the state of Connecticut. In fact, this early map, that's what they called it, the New Connecticut. Now, as a state, they couldn't own it, so that in 1795, they sold it to a bunch of investors from Connecticut, and they bought the Western Reserve for a whole $1 million plus, give or take. And it's 120 miles across. It's the upper part of the state of Ohio today is the Western Reserve. And here it is. I want to point out on the map, it says Firelands. And if you go out to this area of the Western Reserve, you'll see Firelands, high school Firelands, gas station Firelands, this. There were no fires there. The fires were in the Revolutionary War in Connecticut. And the people of Connecticut said, we will give the survivors of these fires called the sufferers, land in the New Connecticut if we win this war. Of course, we did. But they were very, very clever. They only gave them what is Huron and Erie counties today. And that's why that whole area is called the Firelands. And eventually those claims were made up there. What happened to the rest of it? Land speculation. We're selling we're making profit. We're going to sell all the rest of it off and all be happily wealthy afterwards. Well, it didn't happen that quickly. This gentleman had to come out in 1796, July 22nd, 1796. Moses Cleveland, one of the investors, he was not a surveyor, by the way, he was a lawyer. So they had the surveying party by a lawyer. Didn't work out so well. They didn't finish. His charge was to make a map of the area so they could collect their taxes. And so a map is going to be drawn, and he's responsible for it, but it doesn't really happen. Eventually, the second year, they sent out a surveying party. This time they wised up, and they have a surveyor, Seth Pease, as the head of the surveying party. He lays out, he finishes the map. But Moses Cleveland comes and spends a whole 4 months in what's downtown Cleveland. He lays out the public square. He lays out the first streets after the Great Lakes, Superior, Ontario, and so on. He spends a whole 4 months in downtown Cleveland, At the end of it, he gets back in his dinghy, goes back to Connecticut, never comes back again. So much for the founder of the city of Cleveland. But in 1888, they decided to put a statue of him on Public Square. No one knows what he looked like. That painting you see and the statue you see all came from written descriptions of the man. In fact, when the statue was first made in 1888, the city council decided it was too tall, and they rejected it. So the sculptor cut out the midriff, a section, and welded them back together again. And that's the statue on Public Square. City of Cleveland first becomes a village in 1814, 1815. People are not knocking down the trees to get out here. It was not developing overnight. It was a very slow go. Until the announcement of the Ohio Canal in 1825. From 1825 to 1832, they cut a canal right through the state of Ohio until it hits the Ohio River. That same year, they start building it from Cleveland, 1825. That same year, the Erie Canal, going through the state of New York and coming to Lake Erie, is completed. So now we have the trade coming from New York to Lake Erie, and now with the Ohio Canal, they could come all the way through the state of Ohio, and as soon as it hit the Ohio River, they could get to the Mississippi. And at that instant, Cleveland becomes the trade crossroads between New Orleans and New York. And that's what put us on the map. This canal that very few people know we even had in Cleveland, but we did. And who built the canal? Not the New Englanders, not the people from Connecticut that set up the status quo. They were looking for cheap labor. Fortunately for them, the Irish and the Germans were coming in great numbers, and they provide the labor and the technology to build the canal. And that brings Irish and Germans in great numbers to this area over the next several decades. Now, they bring something else with them besides their ethnicity. The first churches are going to be of the Protestant denomination. They're from Connecticut. And so we get First Presbyterian. You know it as Old Stone Church on Public Square. It's built 1834. That's the original one. It sits on the same site as the present one, which is built in 1853. And then you have First Baptist, which stood where the Terminal Tower now stands. So they were all around Public Square. That makes sense. 1836, the very next year, after the Baptist church is built, you have Ohio City becoming the first incorporated city in the Western Reserve. As usual, Cleveland was late by 2 days. They become a city 2 days later. But the first city in the Western Reserve incorporated as a city is Ohio City. And by the way, this was part of Ohio City. Ohio City went from the middle of the Cuyahoga River to just beyond West 65th, and from the lake all the way to I-90, Walworth Run. It's a large area. It finally merges and becomes the west side in 1854. It lasted a whole 18 years. Now we have Germans and Irish coming to the area. They bring a new religion with them, Catholicism. And so by the 1840s, there were enough Catholics running around, they decide to build the first church. And this is St. Mary's on the Flats, built 1840. It's not too far from Mariner's Wharf. It's on Columbus Street. Most of the ethnic people that came through Cleveland started out in this church. They didn't have their own, so they borrowed this one until they could get their own. This is finally torn down in 1888. The first bishop of Cleveland is this man. But don't forget, most of the Catholics were German and Irish. He wasn't. This is Amadeus Rapp. He was French. And so he didn't really align with their ethnic background and felt the best way they could compete with the status quo, with the Yankees, was to be like them. And so he suppressed ethnicity. He wasn't very popular. Eventually, he builds the first cathedral downtown. This is St. John's as it originally appeared 1848 to 52. It's designed by this man, Charles Keeley. There's a whole Keeley society. He built over 16 cathedrals, hundreds of churches. He was one of the leading architects of the mid-19th century. This is what St. John's was one of the first or second structures he designed. In 1946-47, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the diocese, they decided to take the original form, and there's the bishop's palace right behind it, and they decided to remodel. And that's what happened. They cut off the front, they cut off the back. It's constructed, though, with a wooden interior, with wooden and plaster vaulting, just like this church, just like Stevens. This is plaster vaulting you're looking at. And I want you to notice that above here, you've got all that space. Well, above here, there's another 15 feet. And to the very peak of this, it's 50 feet. So it's 75 feet to the very peak of this structure. That's it, the cathedral under construction, and of course, as it looks today with this crazy crab orchard mural stone covering on the outside. But the original cathedral is buried inside there. St. John, here's St. Mary's again, but the offspring for the Germans on the west side would be this church, St. Mary's, on West 30th, just north of Lorraine, right across from St. Ignatius High School is where this one stood. It's built 1863 to 65. It had a spire that burned twice. Then eventually they decided no more spire, and they put a dome over the top of the tower. And then in 1968, the Jesuits took over control, and they decided they needed a science building more than they needed a church. And so, before I get to that, I want to point out, this is rather important. This is the outside wall of St. Mary's. This is concrete, because this church, the earlier photograph shows it in its original form. It was brick with some stone decoration. That was a cheaper way to build. But many of the congregations said, we don't want the cheap, we want the status, and status is stone. And so in early 1900, it's decided some crazy person invented a system to smear concrete all over the outside of these brick buildings and give it a rock face so that it too could look like stone. The first artificial siding of anything shows up on these churches right at the early 20th century. Unfortunately, over time, they crack up, they start falling off the building. St. Peter's on Superior and East 17th has this on it today, and go take a look at it and count the cracks. But in 1968, it's decided that St. Mary's is coming down for a science building, and it was demolished. And the saints are being carted off. The founder, not the founder, but the priest at the time of the building of St. Mary's was this man. This is Stephen Falk. And in 1869, the bishop at the time, who is the French bishop, Amadeus Rapp, commissioned him to start another congregation of Germans. There were so many Germans moving into the area. So west of West 44th was going to be a new parish. And he founds what will become this parish, and he calls it St. Stephen. This is Stephen Falk. Where did he get the name? Go figure. He builds the first church, which is right behind the apse of the church in the schoolyard in 1870. But the man that takes it over is this one. This is Casimir Reichland. Reichland is ordained in 1870. This is his first parish. And he's 27 years old at the time. And he will build everything. The church, the school, the convent, the rectory, the high school, all is built by this man before he dies in 1917. This is the rectory he builds in its original form in 1872. So the very first thing he does is a home for himself. What a surprise. And then he builds a convent, and then this is the school on West 57th behind us with a dirt road. It was a Gothic revival structure, still stands. But as to the church, he decides to hire the architects that had designed this structure. This is St. Joseph's over on Woodland, around East 22nd, Charity Hospital, that area. A wonderful structure, and it was designed by Cleveland architects Cadell and Richardson. Now, before you get into, oh my gosh, a German church, it must be German architecture. Nope. This is called Gothic Revival. And that's what happens in the 19th century. And the Gothic Revival as a style is championed by the English, not by the Germans. Everyone goes with the flow once the popularity sinks in. This is not German architecture. This is Victorian architecture, if you will. It's very romanticized, and I'll get into that in a minute. But Cadell and Richardson. Cadell was German, but Richardson was born in Scotland. How German is that? They built in the fashion of the time. Now, Cadell and Richardson would also do many other things. There's St. Joseph's when it was still standing. This is on Woodland. It was a landmark as you were going into downtown Cleveland. In the 1993, it catches fire and burns to the ground. Really a tragic loss. We'll talk about this a little later. Cadell and Richardson would go on to design many other structures. Unfortunately, a lot of them didn't fare very well. This was a wonderful building on the corner of West 25th and Church Avenue. Very few people realize that it once looked like this because it looked like this for the longest time. Today, it looks like this. Key Bank is located in it, but it had 2 more floors. The tornado of 1953 devastated the top of the building, and it was removed. Their masterpiece is the Perry Payne Building downtown around West 9th. It's almost all, you start looking at it, you can see all the glass, the windows kind of dominate. We're moving towards the modern. This is one of the last of their designs. But the most infamous of the designs is this structure on Franklin Avenue. The faded, fickle, haunted house of Ohio City was designed by Cadell and Richardson. Reichland hires them because they had done St. Joseph's in 1871. 1873 has them design St. Stephen's, the outside of this building. There's their drawing for the structure. Originally was going to have a big spire of stone. The Germans like stone spires, and so that was originally the plan. The nice thing about Cadell and Richardson, if you're studying them, they signed all their buildings. Their name is always to be found somewhere on their building. On the side of the outside, you'll see Cadell and Richardson. Here's the cornerstone. It's built 1873, which is a very significant national year. 1873 was a major financial panic that started in 73. It almost took 10 years to recover. Regardless of the panic, the Germans that started their building less than 2 weeks before the actual panic took shape, they had no idea it was coming. They had their cornerstone laid, and two weeks later, we have this great panic. And it lasts for almost a decade. And so what happened, several of the parishioners actually went to the bank and put their own properties up to make sure that the construction would keep going forward, and slowly, slowly continued. And by the way, this is an early depiction of it without the tower. They're going to build of stone. Panic, no panic, they don't care. We're still going to build of stone, and so they did. Amherst sandstone. By 1876, the roof is up, it is enclosed. This is the inside, but briefly I wanted to point out the reason I'm showing this now. The style of the structure, as I mentioned, is Gothic Revival, but it's this Victorian Gothic Revival. The early Gothic Revival was whimsical. They weren't too interested in all the academic correctness of the original medieval Gothic. It wouldn't be till later on in the century and into the 20th century that architects come in and become more serious. And to underline this, these columns you see here, they're covered in plaster. They're not holding up anything. What's holding it up is inside the plaster. They're huge wooden timbers that rise up and then branch out and hold the slate roof. When this is first opened and dedicated, well, the first service, by the way, was 2 days before the nation celebrates our centennial in Philadelphia. July 2nd, 1876, the first Mass is held inside this building. And at that time, it was a pole barn. There was no vaulting, there was no plaster. You had it 75 foot to the top, and it was like being in an old barn, and it would be for 5 years. Just before they dedicate the church in 1881, the first set of stained glass windows come in. They're geometric, they're just to fill the opening so they could actually have services in the winter. If you look at the window over the pipe organ in the back, that's one of the original geometric windows. You can see the pattern back there. That's the original set of glass. Very, very simple, just so they can enclose it. In 1881, they dedicate the church. 1881, this is the Gothic Revival. Let me give you some background on that. The Gothic Revival, as I said, was championed by the English. And here they're showing they've decided that the Gothic Revival represented English nationalism. They come together as a nation during the medieval period. And so they revive the pointed arch style. You can always tell a Gothic building looking to the windows. They go to a point. Chances are you're in a Gothic Revival building. The English decided that the Gothic, especially for churches, was ideal. Up to that point, many of the churches in England were being built in the classical style, with Roman and Greek inspiration, classical columns, those were based on pagan temples. And the English decided, pagan temples for churches? That's just wrong. And so by the 19th century, they decided the churches should go Gothic as well, because the pointed arch also represented Christianity. And so it starts moving towards the Gothic Revival as a fine style to use. And they champion it, spreads across the continent and also in this country as well. And again, the Houses of Parliament are completed in 1860, just before our Civil War, and it's of the Gothic Revival style. Here at St. Stephen's, we have Gothic tokens. Flying buttresses are a Gothic thing. There's a flying buttress on this church right beyond this wall. It's the only flying buttress on the west side, by the way. It doesn't hold up anything, but it is a really nice little Gothic touch on this Gothic Revival building. In 1881, the interior is plastered, as I said. They also will dedicate the church at that time, but it looked like this before all the furnishings come in. The very first statue that comes into the church is the large cross under the canopy there. That's called a mission cross. Missions were like renewals in the Catholic Church. You would do a whole year of activities, and eventually you'd mark the fact that the parish had made it all the way through this renewal, and they'd put a cross in the church. So here's what this very first statue is, that cross, and it's put in 1892. Now, the very next year, 1893, 3 statues are added below. And they're designed by a German sculptor who comes to this country. Bernard Schildmacher was his name, good Irish name. He would design the 3 figures at the bottom of the cross. And I want to point out something about the statues in this church. There are several things that are unique to this church. The statues are one of them, and that is because they're made of wood, individually sculpted. They're not repeated. They're not coming from a mold, an old chorus line of saying so-and-so popping out of a mold. These are individually wooden figures sculpted and then polychromed, painted, as you see here. To emphasize that, I actually crawled up behind these things, and you can see, if you can see it all, these are the backs of those figures up there. They're hollowed out in the back like a canoe. You can see the chisel marks. That's because a statue of wood in a cold climate you want hollow so that the surface can expand and contract. A solid figure tends to crack. And so in the back, they look very, very crude. And then you look at them from the front, and the detail goes on and on and on, including the Virgin Mary has tears painted on her cheek. Now, also another feature that's kind of special in this church is the use of canopies. They're called baldachins. That's the center large canopy you see there. And mostly in the the Gothic Revival churches in this country, they would build a screen behind the altar called a rear das. And the Germans in the late Gothic period began building them higher and higher and higher. So here, when we have the Gothic Revival, the German parishes like St. Michael's, not far from us in Tremont, that's the church to the right, has this huge screen in the back. That's typically German, and it's called a rear das. St. Stanislaus is on the left. And again, you get a large screen or rear das. That's the typical form, with statues all filling the niches. Stephen's didn't go that route at all. It built baldachins, and the baldachin comes to us through many, many centuries until it becomes architectural. It's first a canvas over the emperor or the clergy, then eventually becomes architectural, and the masterpiece of that, of course, is Bernini's baldachin at the Vatican. But there were a few exceptions for the baldachin in the Gothic Revival time. This is the Prince Albert Memorial that Queen Victoria built for her husband. It is completed in 1876. Stephen's is being built. This is being installed. So, and I'm saying it's a direct connection, but it was the kind of thing saying, well, baldachins can be done in the Gothic. See? Stephen's not only has the main baldachin as a feature, the side altars have a baldachin. That's to the Virgin, that's to St. Joseph. In fact, it has baldachins on its baldachins. There's one on the top called a cupola. In fact, the side ones have them as well. A unique feature, think of another church that has canopies all over the place like this church has. White oak is the construction material. Then we have another German sculptor. This is Joseph Dressel, Munich, Germany. He would do the other half of the statues in this church. Schildmacher would do half, and Dressel would do the other half. The nice thing about Dressel, he signed his statues, and I've crawled around them. You can find his name. This is Dressel in his studio. Here he is. He would do half the statues, and you can tell the difference between the two. This is actually one of the figures in his studio. It's the Virgin statue over there, the statue of the Sacred Heart of Mary. This is a similar one. This is not the same. It looks like it's stone, but actually it's wooden and then painted over with gesso. The gesso makes it look like stone, and then they paint it. So that's one of the figures in the studio. In 1982, I received a letter from the graduate student at Stuttgart. In Stuttgart, he was doing his master's thesis on Joseph Dressel. And amongst his papers, he found a commission for a church in the United States, in Cleveland, Ohio, the Church of St. Stephen. Please, sir, do any of these figures still exist? He listed all the statues that Dressel had done in their German names and when they were shipped in 1893. I sent back to him, yes, all of them are still here, and all of them can be seen. These are examples. You can tell the difference between the two sculptors. This is a Bernard Schildmacher, and this is a Dressel. Dressel's figures have gems set in the hems of the figures. You'll see glass gems, either along the bottom or around the neck. That's Dressel. No gems, then it's going to be Schildmacher. Humanizing the statuary, another thing that St. Stephen's has that most do not have. A little bit, but not like here. Most of them have statues and niches, individual statues. That's the norm. That's St. Patrick's to the right and St. Stanislaus to the left. Typical installation of statuary. And then you have this. Way in the top of the large baldachin, you have a crown enthroned male figure. Who is it? It's God the Father. And I want you to note, he's not alone. There are two angels at his feet that have the flambeaux, the burning of incense, and then you have two more angels, one on either side. One plays a lute, the other a harp. The celestial sound for God. That's God in his heaven. And it's meant to be seen as a group, not just individual figures in a niche, but seen together, relating to one another. It comes from the medieval form. This is the coronation of the Virgin in Reims Cathedral in France. Truly a medieval inspiration, but you can see there's an interplay. They're not just separated statues in a niche. In fact, here's another example. We have two niches, but we're going to break right through and give communion to this night. Again, Cathedral of Reims. And that's where this idea comes from, to actually group them together, not just in a single statue in a niche. I want to point out, God the Father you see here, often he is shown as an abstraction, a hand from a cloud, an eye in a triangle like in the back of our dollar bill. Rare do you find him as a human form, even as a painting there. Rarer still to find him in a three-dimensional depiction, such as you do here at St. Stephen. So now you know what he looks like. Under the large canopy, you have the large crucified Christ. As you're coming up the center aisle, about midway up, if you look up, you will notice that, yeah, there's the cross. And I'll come closer here. Whoop. On either side, there are four angels that are about 2/3 of the way up on those columns, and they're dark now, because if there's any electricians in here that want to donate some time to this church, the light floods, and there's 16 floods in the front of those. They should be brightly lit. They need to be rewired, but not the angels, but the lights. Anyway, there's four of them up there, and they're meant to be seen all together. And by the way, when you have a cross and two figures, you don't have to have three, just two. St. John and the Virgin, that's called a rood grouping, R-O-O-D. It's a Saxon word for cross. And that motif is seen throughout Christianity. And you see it here, and they added the bonus of a third figure at the bottom, Mary Magdalene, holding the robes of Christ in her arms. It's called a rood grouping. I want to point out something else too. You see the male figure on the side there, under the cross? That's supposed to be St. John. But notice the vestment, the clothing that male figure wears. It is split down the side. It's a dalmatic. It's the figure, or it's a vestment of a deacon. St. John was not a deacon. St. Stephen was the first martyr, dying 33 years after Christ. That's the story of St. Stephen in that stained glass window over there. At the bottom, he's speaking to the scribes and Pharisees, and for that blasphemy, the way he put it, he was taken outside the walls of Jerusalem, which is on the top register, and stoned to death. The first martyr. So, martyrs are often shown, if you want to symbolize a martyr, you put a palm in their hand. Notice at the very top of that window and the top of this window, there is an angel holding a palm in his hand. This is St. Lawrence. They're always coupled, by the way. Stephen Lawrence through history. I don't know why. They were both deacons, 200 years apart. I'll give you some more background on it if you want later. But he was a he was a martyr as well, and so he has a martyr's palm. That side altar over there, above the St. Joseph's altar at the top, is St. Casimir. He too was martyred. Notice in his hand, that's not a quill to write, that's a martyr's palm. Back to the figure under the cross. Notice that male figure's holding up his hand. Hand's not, oh my, this is a terrible thing that's happened. No, the hand originally from old photographs held a martyr's palm in it. Just to underline, in this church, the Germans were putting their patron saint right under the cross, even though historically he's not supposed to be there. But in this church, they're paying for it, they're going to see it their way, and they do. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, when the tornado struck, and I'll give you background on that in a little bit, someone said, oh, it's supposed to be St. John, not St. Stephen. So they removed the palm. But now you know the truth. Oh, by the way, I didn't finish this other part. Let me go back a second if I can get it. Yes, those four angels, if you look very closely, it's very hard to see. On the far right, that angel over there is holding a hammer and nails. The next one holds a lance. The third one holds a pole with a sponge, and the last one over here holds his hand out with a crown of thorns, which have fallen out since we have photographs showing the crown of thorns. But anyway, those are the symbols of the passion of Christ, and they flank the horizontal bars of the crucified Christ under the canopy. They're meant to be seen as you're coming up the main aisle. They're not just up there by chance. They underline the passion of Christ. Those angels are deliberately placed where you see them. This one this is my favorite statue in the church as far as its humanizing aspect. This is St. Anne and the Virgin Mary as a child. She's the first teacher, so she's going to put her hand on the shoulder of her daughter. She's going to guide her. Whenever they show St. Anne, she is wearing rose and green. Rose and green. Also, she holds a symbol of education because she's the Virgin's first teacher. In the Byzantine church, it'll be a scroll. In the Western church, it'll be a book. But I want to point out something about this book in this church. Notice that St. Anne looks down, and the only one that looks out at the crowd is the Virgin, because she's the important figure. Her mother just looks down, but her mother was busy reading when you first came up, and she stopped reading, so it was a photo op. You could take your pictures, and she puts her finger in the book to keep her page, because once you leave, she's going back to reading, don't you know? Again, humanizing the depiction. So even though there are two figures here, that idea of making it a little bit more human is designed right into the figure. Right over by the Virgin's altar, we'll talk about, I'll go over there and point it out at the end of this. Inside of the church was laid out deliberately. Even the seating was planned. Here's the inside of the church. On this side of the church, you will notice, you got one? Yeah. There are clips, but that one's broken. There are clips on the backs of the pews on that side of the church. No clips on this side. That side is lining itself with the St. Joseph's altar. The males, sat on this side, and what did they do with their hats? They took them off and put them on the clip. Until recently, women always had their heads covered, so they needed no clips on this side, and they aligned themselves with the side altar dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Virgin Mary on that side, women and children on this side, men and boys on this side, and therefore the clips. I want to point out something else too. There's a St. Joseph's altar for that side and the Virgin's altar on this side. Even the statues in this church, the female saints in this church who have their heads covered. There's the Virgin, St. Elizabeth, and St. Anne. They have veils over their head. Again, to keep that idea that women covered their heads. Except for one, Mary Magdalene. We'll talk about her a little later. On the high altar, though, there's a puzzle. On the side wall over here, there are female saints over there. On this side, there are male saints over here. Seems a little confused, doesn't it? We have the Virgin's altar here, yet we have male figures right on the wall, right around the corner. No, the statues are not meant to be idols. The statues are meant to be seen. So how can they be seen if they're on the same side as you are? They place them diagonally across from the group they are to inspire. In fact, if you could see, there's a light that blocks it anyway. There's the male saints. But on the right, the first saint, St. Elizabeth, turns her head out and looks out at this side of the church. because she's looking to the women. And by the way, by the 1890s and turn of the century, a lot of Hungarians come to this neighborhood. And so now we have Germans and Hungarians. St. Elizabeth of Hungary was a saint shared by both the Germans and the Hungarians. And by the way, if you think about it, where's the big Hungarian church on the west side? There isn't any. St. Emmerich is not a huge church. St. Emmerich is a Hungarian church, but not like Stephen's, not like Michael's. The big Hungarian church is on the east side, St. Elizabeth's. So this is because many of the Hungarians worshipped with the Germans at St. Michael's, St. Stephen's, and so on. And that's an indication of it there to have their saint inside the church. Now we spin the church around the other way. If you look down the side aisle over there, you have the St. Joseph's altar up here, but at the other end of the aisle, the stained glass window that's above that door is a rare depiction of what? The death of St. Joseph, facing the St. Joseph altar. Again, they're not just making the stuff up. Everything has a reason, has a rhyme. On the other side of the church, you have the Virgin's altar. That's this side. But at the other end of that aisle, that window is the Holy Family, but the description is called the Christian Mutter, the Christian Mother. They're celebrating the Virgin, and she faces her altar. So again, all these things are lined up. And then transversing the back of the church, from that side to that side, you have the only ethnic window in this church. That's this one. Widukind was a Saxon warrior that led the Germans, before they were German, into the 33-year war against Charlemagne. Eventually, Charlemagne caught him, but he was not going to make Widukind a martyr, so he decides, oh, he's pagan. I will convert him to Christianity, and he will be baptized. And that's what's in that window. It is a depiction of Widukind being baptized, and who's the godfather? Charlemagne is his godfather. He's going to keep an eye on him. But that's the only German ethnic window in this church. On the other side, facing it, is the baptism again, this time the baptism of Christ. In fact, the compositions are rather similar if you look at them. Ethnicity is subtle in this church. It doesn't club you over the head. Here you have the Virgin Mary in a very domestic scene, and here you have a statue of the Virgin Mary, whether in statuary or stained glass form. Notice her face. Light complexion, blue eyes, and blonde hair. The dark-haired Mediterranean Madonna was not going to find a place in a German-built church, and she doesn't. In fact, all the saints and angels look more Aryan than they ever would biblically. That's the subtlety. Then you have this. At the base of the cross is Mary Magdalene, the only female without her head covered. Notice her hairstyle. Big, bold braid in her hair. Now you can imagine the German maidens sitting on this side of the church looked up, and guess what? Their hair was up in braids. They're looking to Mary Magdalene, which wasn't very Jewish, but in a German church, it's appropriate. They could relate, and that's why she's shown that way. There's the ethnicity. It's subtle. Now, the Tower of Stevens is not added until 1907, and I have a theory about it. Originally, it was supposed to be like that with a spire. Didn't come about because of the Depression of '73. But I found this newspaper article announcing the tower was going to be built in 1905. And in the article it said, yeah, we were going to do a big spire on it, but it's now prohibited. What do you mean prohibited? My theory is, and I haven't been able to prove it yet, 1 year prior to the tower being constructed, the city put out the very first building code in 1904. It's the first in the nation, by the way. It's a model for across the nation, our building code, believe it or not, 1904. I haven't found it in the building code, but I believe somewhere in there it says, no more spires. Can you point to a church that has a spire, a substantial spire, after 1904? Not until they do the one on Old Stone Church it was 1999, I think. They had forgotten all about this stuff by then. But there are no spires, and I think because they fell, St. Stanislaus, during the tornado of 1909, the spire came down and crushed a little kid. You know, there were fires. It said no more spires. So the spire is not built in 1909. They made a more prominent, taller tower, and that's the finish of St. Stephen's in 1909. Also, the windows are going to show up about 2 years later in 1907. This is the resurrection window, which is right over there, the second one back. I want to point out the figures here, they're just wonderfully depicted. These are Meyer Studios of Munich, Germany. These are imported windows. I want to point out These two figures, I think, are wonderful. The way the angel is depicted and all the detailing is just marvelous. On the night, though, he's one of my favorite figures in the stained glass because he looks so relaxed. It's kind of like wake me when it's over. And Michelangelo in the Renaissance told us how to make a figure look relaxed. He painted them on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You cross their legs. They're not going to spring up and attack you if their legs are crossed. They're out for the count. And that's what he represents. Now, some of the stained glasses, there's some fun things with this. This is the finding in the temple, which is over there, the second window down on that side. And this is the same window, also from the Munich studios of Munich, Germany, found at St. Patrick's, just down the street. We have the Irish down there, and we have the Germans here, only a few blocks apart. They both have the same type of windows. They were made in Munich. And the Meyer studios would use the same drawing over and over again as a starting point, so you can see the compositions are similar, but I want to point out some differences. This is the detail of finding of the temple, this figure. Notice this is the one from St. Stephen's, and again you can still see it's the second window over there. This is the same window at St. Patrick's. You can see it's the same composition, but I want you to notice something. Here's a close-up of St. Patrick's. The fabric on it is very, very nicely modeled in ruby. And here's Stephen's. Brocade, we're going to add patterns, we're going to add other colors to it. The Germans are going to have all the bells and whistles. The Irish, nice windows, but not quite what the Germans would have. Step further, this is the marriage feast at Cana. It's the back window on the right, the very last large one. This is from St. Stephen's, the marriage feast at Cana, and here's St. Patrick's. Very similar cartoon, same drawing that brought both of them about. But I want to show a subtlety here. The artist decided to use a piece of glass, a single piece of glass, pouring down from the servant's jar into this, and as the water comes down, it turns to wine. The miracle right before your eyes. St. Patrick's, same composition, no wine. What happened? Here's a servant above the head of the Virgin and the St. Stephen's. Notice the tray has a flask and a goblet. Here's the Irish. No goblet, just bread and fruit. We don't do this thing with the wine, you know, it's kind of tempting. In fact, the window right across at St. Patrick's that faces this window is this window, and this one was dedicated by the St. Patrick's Ladies Total Abstinence Society. We don't want to tempt those Irish, so we don't, even in the miracle, this is the miracle of that depiction. No wine, please. Another feature in here that's quite unique is the pulpit. The pulpit is unique in that it has a 30-foot high soundboard. That's all that is, a soundboard. This is before the church, of course, had any electricity, and so the soundboard was made to get the sound into the church. But the rest of it's all decoration. And the real importance of this form, it's Gothic revival in style, but notice only the 4 small columns in the back hold that whole thing up in the air. It's an engineering feat. It stands at all. They commonly, when you had that form, would be attached to a column or a pier, as they are at St. Michael's and they were at St. Stanislaus before it lost the canopy. Now, here's the church before 1953. On the outside, it was quite dark, almost black, like St. Michael's. June 8th, 1953, a tornado strikes the west side. 8 people die. It's devastating. Here's a map of the route for the tornado. It starts out by our airport, works its way west, hits all the various churches along the way. St. Coman's gets it, Stephen's gets it, Franklin Circle gets it, St. John's Episcopal gets it. It goes over the valley, goes across Public Square, and eventually out to the lake. Devastating storm. St. Stephen's is one of the worst hit by the storm. There's the damage. Ken, there's the photo you sent me. The damage here was almost over $3 million worth of damage in today's dollars. The miracle here is there was a woman, God bless her soul, and I should know her name and I can't remember it right now, but she was able, a year prior to the tornado striking, she did something back then which was very gutsy. She married an Irishman. She was actually a German maiden from this church, but she married an Irishman who had an insurance company. And And she decided to market her husband's products. And from this pulpit, the pastor at the time was Monsignor Gertz. And I'm told Gertz, his sermons were fire and brimstone. He was not an easy guy to get along with. But I imagine she must have hit him on the head with a ball-peen hammer one day and said, "You need insurance through my husband's business." In 1952, he listens and picks up insurance. And because of this woman, when the tornado strikes and damages 80% of these Munich windows are destroyed. Part of the roof, which is slate, is thrown throughout the neighborhood. I was born in a house across the street, actually. I can see the door in my back of my house. The slate went through the sides of our house and cut across the kitchen. I was in a bassinet during the time, and the window shattered and glass was everywhere. So it was very much a devastating storm, and because of that insurance, they were able to totally restore this church. In 1953, when people are looking to move out of the city and nothing's being restored, this church was. A new slate roof. They even went back to Munich. There's the damage. And they went back to the Meyer Studios of Munich, Germany. They were still together even after World War II. In fact, a couple years ago, well, many years ago, I was given the honor of guiding the great-great-great-grandson of Meyers, who had come to this country to see his great-great-great-grandfather's work. And I brought him through many of the churches in Cleveland, including Stevens. He was very, very complimentary. Now, what happened after the tornado, they restored everything except, for years, these large windows behind the ball. They were the first windows installed. But after the tornado, they didn't restore them. They boarded them up and put an elaborate lighting system to compensate. And for almost 50 years, it was like that until 1993. 1993, this is St. Joseph's on Woodland. St. Joseph's was closed as a parish. Its stained glass windows were from Meyer's Munich windows, just like Stevens. They had been taken out prior to the church closing and sent to St. Raphael's in Bay Village, and so they were there. I had done a lot of research even back then and found a slide at the Cleveland Museum of Art's library that showed the inside of Stevens before the tornado. It showed it with all its, let me do this, St. Joseph had these crazy light bulbs. That's the inside of St. Joseph's. All these ethnic churches, many of them, had little light bulbs outlining the interiors. They decided, don't forget, this was first lit by gas. There was no electricity when this opened. The lights were first installed in 1907. And at that time, they decided, hey, look at all this inventiveness of the Americans. We want to celebrate something. Well, we're not the industrialists. We're not going to do what they're doing in their churches. I got it. We will celebrate the invention of the electric light bulb. And we'll outline all our arches with little light bulbs. By the 1950s, though, people thought, oh my gosh, it looks more like Coney Island or Cedar Point and not a sanctuary. And they unscrewed the bulbs. But if you look closely into the canopy, you'll find those sockets. They're still there. But St. Joseph had them as well, so that's what that is. Unfortunately, just before the announcement to save St. Joseph, arson hit, and St. Joseph was burned to the ground in 1993. Fortunately, the windows had been removed, as I said, and because the Art Museum had that photograph, I was able to see what the narratives were, what the depictions were in the original windows. So they sent me out to St. Raphael's, and I went through the St. Joseph's windows and matched them the best I could. And Father, Father Franz, he raised, I don't know how he did it, he raised the money to actually restore those windows. So the three windows you see behind there, they're from St. Joseph's. And so St. Joseph's now completes St. Stephen's window plan. And one of the weird things that happened when they were installing these windows, and I worked with the stained glass company to make them fit in here, Whitney Stained Glass is a major stained glass studio in Cleveland. They were raising the windows into place as I pulled up in front of the church to see the progress. And as I got out of my car, the radio announced that the Church of St. Joseph's on Woodland was now totally engulfed in flames. And as I walked into the church, they were putting St. Joseph's windows in place. It's a wonderful thing that it happened. So again, we're once more complete because of, I think, basically a miracle. The windows at St. Stephen's, this is a window on the outside. The architects, Cadell and Richardson, were very creative. They had whimsy in their mind a lot of the time. Some of the decorations defy description architecturally. Here we have a wonderful figure. These are gargoyles. They are functioning gargoyles. That window I just showed you, water runs down the glass to a trough and then runs out of the mouths of the gargoyles on either side. They're the only functioning gargoyles in the city. Gargoyles are a drain. They can just be a spout. That's still a gargoyle. We've kind of made the idea they have to be a grotesque. Grotesque came a little later, and they're not the kind of thing that necessarily defines a gargoyle. A gargoyle must drain. These are the only ones that function in Cleveland. In the 1950s, I always thought the Creature of the Black Lagoon looked a lot like our gargoyles on St. Stephen's. Little kids have crazy imaginations, and imagine mine. Anyway, they're fun details. Now, the 19th century Gothic revival shares a heritage both in Europe and in America. Something that most people don't realize, the 19th century Gothic revival opened the door to allow Gothic to come back. Before that, all the styles for centuries after the Gothic went out of fashion was classical. Classical columns, classical exteriors. The Renaissance comes in, and it's not Gothic at all. It's against the Gothic. And so we have things that people think were all medieval, like this is the Cathedral of Milan. This is what it looked like in 1806. That's the facade of it. People look at it today, and yes, it's a wonderful facade, but it was built in the 19th century. It's a product of the Gothic revival. Here we have a German structure. This is Cologne Cathedral. It's from the mid-13th century it started, but it looked like this for centuries. Here's 1840, and still no body, the nave or the front is not complete. 15 years later, in 1855, they finally build the nave and they start building the towers. And then in 1875, they're now building the front of it. 1875, Stevens is being built, very same time. And then 1880, a year before this church is dedicated, they complete Cologne Cathedral. So Cologne Cathedral is Gothic revival, or at least in the spirit of it. It's not built in the medieval period for the most part. At least the parts that you look at and recognize were built at the same time this church was being built. Here's another example. This is Ulm Cathedral, which claims to be the largest spired tower in the world. Can you see it? No, because it's not there yet. They started this in the 14th century, and this is what it looked like in the 17th century. 1842, it hadn't changed much. By 1885, they start building again. They're putting a roof over the nave, they're adding the two towers in the back, and then they start construction of this magnificent spire in the front. That's 1889. In 1890, they finally complete this structure. Again, a product of the 19th century, Gothic revival, just like this church. Here's one of the early masterpieces, is Notre Dame Cathedral, which is mid-12th century when it began. And yes, it's all medieval for the most part, except people looked at that flush tower, the spire that burnt and fell off. That was built in the 19th century. This is Viollet de Duc's design, these are his drawings rather, and here is the dates of when they were actually done. This is being rebuilt again, but it's built in the 19th century. It's Gothic revival. And people associate the grotesques, if you will. They're not quite gargoyles, they're not draining, but these figures are well known as being the Notre Dame grotesques. Well, they were actually installed in 1856, mid-19th century. They were not there. What I'm trying to say with all of this is that Stevens is a small example compared to these great cathedrals, but it shares the same romantic origin as these other great cathedrals. There they are, they will save those. Our question is, can we have enough interest to try to save something like this? This is a depiction of the inside of the St. Joseph's altar over there. In 1977, I placed this on the National Register, and it was accepted on the National Register. When you're placed on the National Register, the owner, the very last step is for the owner to sign off. I fooled them down at the Chancellery, and they signed off on it. I was shocked, but they did. I did a couple others. I did St. Michael's, I worked on St. Coleman's, and then the bishop figured out what I was doing. It was Hickey at the time, Bishop Hickey, and he said, no more. I don't want any of my property to be on the National Register, and stopped it. And by the way, the bishop of the Catholic diocese, whoever he is, owns every piece of land, every building, every church. New bishop comes in, ta-da, you own everything now. And if you want to close something or tear it down, you're the owner. In the 1980s, 1988, the Cleveland Museum of Art hired and commissioned a rather noted photographer, Servant Robinson, to document Cleveland. I was asked to give him a tour of the sacred architecture of Cleveland. I brought him here as one of the many structures I took him to, and he said, just go away. Bring me in the church, lock the door, and go away. And then he photo documented the whole interior. That's one of his photographs, which is now part of a larger collection that's part of the Cleveland Museum of Art. Stevens is complete on the outside, on the inside, and the vessels, vestments, all of it is to be found in this church. It's one of the most complete of the sacred structures in this region. The big question is, can we hold on to it? And I thank you for allowing me to share my insights on this wonderful, wonderful church. Thank you.
Tim just gave me an idea for a postscript I didn't know we accomplished. So he may not know this, but the last historic district we got added to downtown to trigger investment is the Erie Historic District. If you know how district designation works, if the majority of the owners in the district support the district, it'll happen. So we did have 2 letters against the Erie Historic District. Both those properties are owned by the diocese. It did not stop St. John's or the Chancery when we put it on the National Register. So they were opposed, it didn't matter. And we can attract historic tax credit funds to what was originally the grade school of St. John's was a parish. One of our advocacy projects right now is to try to make sure that gets saved and restored. That's where their offices used to be. They've since moved to a terrible building, architecturally 1404 East 9th, which feels like you're entering a mausoleum. But the Chancery hopefully will get saved, and I have the priest who's the head of properties supportive. So I did not realize what a difficult thing we accomplished till you told me how you kind of snuck it by him. So stay tuned for that issue. I believe we have time for questions. I'll hand the mic back to Tim. And also one reminder, this is the last day of Cleveland History Days. We still have some events after this is over out at Lakeview Cemetery.
Any questions besides, how can he talk so fast? Wow. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, it is. That's St. Aloysius and St. Stanislaus of Koskov's on this side. They were both Jesuits and died very, very young. But most of these statues you see in the front were usually installed because of early societies within the congregation. So I think that was a young boys society that sponsored that. As to what he stands for, I'm not quite, I'd have to look it up, I know I have it. Do you know what the patron saint of what? St. Aloysius. We can look it up. Anyway, yeah, it's usually because it's sponsored by some society within the parish. Yeah. Yes. Yes. They're on the top of the 2/3 of the way up on those columns. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 in front of the baldachin. You're looking, don't look at the altar, look above the baldachin on the top there. They're up there. Yeah, they're way up there. They're meant to be seen as you're coming up the main aisle. They will line up with the crucified Christ. That's where they are, and they hold the symbols of Christ's crucifixion. They flank the cross, 2 on either side. That's what that is. Yeah. Does that crank down the sanctuary lamp? Does that crank down to be lit? Do you know? No, it is supposed to be lit. Yes, it is lit now. How do they light it? How did they light it? Ta-da! Oh, well, you know. Yeah, before that, though, I want to point out, though that is not there's supposed to be a lamp that's totally lit every single day except for 3 days during Holy Week, just before Holy Saturday when it comes back again, the light of the world. Otherwise, there is a vigil light that's constantly on in the sanctuary. That is not the original one. That came later. Someone must have donated it. It's a beautiful piece. The original lamps are the two angels at either side of the bottom of the, you see the altar back there? There are two angels holding torches. Those are the original lamps. Those angels were in the convent basement, the 1961 convent basement, for years and years and years, and someone found them and said, oh, let's bring them back into the church. So there they are, but they were the original ones. The interesting thing is, for me, they originally had their own pedestals. The pedestals are now the lectern. That pedestal you see right behind the communion rail, there's one there and the one behind the screen. They were squared off. If you look at the bottom of it, they're the same size as those angels, and they sat right in the middle of that arch on this side, one there and one on this side. But they decided to modify those to the lecterns after Vatican II, and so when they decided to bring the angels back in again, whoops, no pedestal, and so they kind of sit on the floor on either side, but they're the original. Yes? Oh my God, we can have a real class with that, but I'm not going to do that. Basically, the Gothic, when you're talking about church, you're really talking about engineering. And it's the idea of getting rid of the wall so that you can actually have stone in very thin elements, columns, flying buttresses, taking the weight, and eliminating the need for walls so we can have more light, more stained glass. The peak of the Gothic period is to have large spans of glass. It was really the engineering that made the Gothic the Gothic. This is all romanticized. Everything in here is, again, it was favored. It came back into fashion. In the early 20th century, there will be American architects. In fact, Ralph Adams Cram is an American architect who championed the Gothic, I call it the Neo-Gothic, because he believed had the Renaissance never happened and the Gothic continued, the style would have continued as he built it, because he does St. John the Divine in New York City is his design, and if you look at that today, there's some really interesting engineering that he came up with, and again, he's trying to advance that idea. Let's get rid of the wall and bring more glass in. So that's just one. There's a lot of. It gets very complicated, but that is one of the distinctions between the two: engineering on one side and romanticism on the other. Yes. No, I wish. Yeah, I wish. You're right, and I always thought that too. The National Register is an honor. It's a star on the forehead. It is nice job. All it does is protect, if you're on the National Register, there are different registers, but the National Register basically says federal money cannot be used to demolish or damage as children. If you do, you could still do it, but you'd have a hard time. We don't want to use federal money to damage something on the National Register. So you can't put a freeway through Stevens. But if the bishop, who's not using federal money, he's using donations or whatever, and he wants the building torn down, guess what? National Register? It's not good press, but that's not going to stop him. As you can hear, Tom has a lot of irons in the fires. He's done some wonderful things. They were done local. Half the statues were made in Munich, half the statues made here. All the woodwork was done here overseen by a company, George Faulhaber, not Faulhaber, is it Faulhaber? Yeah, Faulhaber, who had a business in Tremont, just off the bluff. His house was on West 14th. He oversaw the Tyrolean and Swiss craftsmen that actually did all the sculpting, but it was done in his studio. So it was done locally, and many of these were European-trained artisans, but they were here. I'm sorry? Youth and students for St. Aloysius. Youth and students, yes. Yes. You know, I don't know, do we know where the paintings came from? No, they were recently restored, though. They are 16-foot oak frames on the paintings of the Stations of the Cross. At the bottom, for all of you that speak German, you can look at the description on the bottom, which is in German, of what's going on at each station. A number of years ago, I gave a tour through here for a German class that was exchange students, and they went through and had to interpret them. They had a hard time with the font, the way it's actually written, because I also had a class from, I think it was Westlake, that was a German class, and they were charged to translate them as well. And they had a much easier time, maybe because it was all new to them. But those are German descriptions of each one of the stations at the base of them. And those are canvas paintings that were restored in 1993. The pipe organ was installed in 1886. It's the Johnson pipe organ of New England. It was rebuilt in 1938 and again in 1992. It's a very fine instrument. So yeah, again, the church is complete. Yes. Yes.
Thank you for being here. This afternoon at the cemetery, and then this is the last day. So look for it next year. If you donate, become a member of Canalway. One of the benefits is to get the history days scheduled in the mail before the program starts. I don't know that's happening, but so hopefully, and we can start the whole process all over again at the end of July and begin raising money for next year. So thanks again for attending.
Again, we want to welcome everybody here to St. Stephen Church, and you're welcome to walk all about the property and the premises, but please do not come up on the altar area or the sacristy. Please observe that from down here. Thank you.